The crystalline halls of the Galactic Council trembled as Ambassador Zethra of the Vorthak Empire slammed her four-armed fist against the speaking podium. Her crimson eyes blazed with fury as she addressed the assembled representatives of 12 major civilizations. "The humans have crossed every line!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "They have violated the sacred boundaries set by the ancients themselves! This cannot stand!" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sacred boundaries were not merely laws, they were warnings carved into the very fabric of space-time by beings so advanced that current civilizations could barely comprehend their technology. These ancients had vanished eons ago, leaving behind only cryptic warnings and impossible structures that defied all understanding. Council Speaker Thymal, a being of pure energy contained within a shimmering force field, raised his hand for silence. "Ambassador Zethra, please clarify your accusations. What exactly have the humans done?" Zethra activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. The image showed a small blue-green planet orbiting a yellow star, Earth. But something was wrong with the display. Space around Earth seemed to ripple and bend in ways that hurt to look at directly. 3 cycles ago, human scientists detected what they called anomalous readings in their local space, Zethra continued. Instead of reporting this to the Council as required by the Galactic Accords, they decided to investigate on their own. They built machines, terrible machines that pierced through dimensions themselves. The hologram zoomed in to show massive structures orbiting Earth. They looked like twisted metal flowers, each petal covered in incomprehensible geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed. Energy crackled between the structures in colors that had no names. "The humans call them reality anchors," Zethra spat. "They claim these devices stabilize space-time around their world, but they don't understand what they've done. They've awakened something that should have remained sleeping forever." Ambassador Krell of the Zeridian Federation, his insectoid head tilting in confusion, clicked his mandibles nervously. "Surely you exaggerate, Zethra. Humans are barely 2 centuries into space travel. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. How could they possibly—" "Because they don't follow rules," Zethra interrupted. "Every other species in the galaxy understands there are limits to what should be explored. We see the ancient warnings and we heed them. We find technology beyond our understanding and we approach it carefully, respectfully. But humans? They see a warning that says, 'Do not enter,' and they ask, 'Why not?'" She manipulated the hologram again, showing recordings from human research stations. The images were grainy and distorted, but they clearly showed human scientists in environmental suits examining massive ancient artifacts buried deep within asteroids. The artifacts glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "They found ancient technology scattered throughout their solar system," Zethra continued. "Fragments of machines left behind as warnings. Every piece was clearly marked with symbols that translate to danger, forbidden, and do not wake that which sleeps. Do you know what the humans did when they decoded these warnings?" The chamber fell silent. Even the energy being that served as speaker seemed to dim with anticipation. "They used the warnings as an instruction manual," Zethra said quietly. "They studied every symbol, every pattern, every fragment of ancient technology they could find. Then they reverse-engineered it and built their reality anchors to deliberately pierce the barriers the ancients had established around their world." The implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Several representatives began speaking at once, their voices rising in alarm and disbelief. Ambassador Vex of the Quantum Collective, his translucent body flickering between dimensions, spoke in a voice like breaking glass. "If the humans have truly breached the ancient barriers, then they have doomed us all. The ancients didn't place those warnings lightly. They were trying to protect the universe from something so terrible that they sacrificed themselves to contain it. What exactly are these reality anchors doing to spacetime? Speaker Thymol demanded. Zethra's display shifted to show readings from across the galaxy. Every sensor array, every monitoring station, every advanced civilization's most sensitive instruments showed the same thing. Reality itself was beginning to unravel in expanding waves that originated from Earth's solar system. "The barriers aren't just breaking," she whispered. "They're being systematically dismantled. And with each barrier that falls, the distortions grow stronger. Physics itself is becoming unstable. In some regions, time flows backward. In others, gravity works in reverse. And at the epicenter of it all, around Earth, something is happening that our instruments cannot even measure." The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives demanded immediate action. Some called for a military response against humanity. Others suggested evacuation procedures for entire star systems. A few simply sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis. But Zethra wasn't finished. She raised her hands for attention, and her voice carried a note of absolute terror that cut through the noise. "There's more," she said. "Our deep space monitoring stations have detected movement in the spaces between realities, the void realms that the ancients sealed away. Something vast and ancient is stirring, something that has been waiting for the barriers to weaken." She activated a final holographic display that showed the edge of known space. The image was mostly empty, a field of stars with nothing unusual visible. But the sensor readings told a different story. Energy signatures unlike anything in recorded history were approaching from the darkness beyond the galaxy's rim. "The ancient warnings weren't just about protecting us from dangerous technology," Zethra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were about keeping something locked away, something that the ancients themselves feared so much that they altered reality itself to contain it." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And the humans, in their infinite curiosity and complete disregard for consequences, have just unlocked the cage." The chamber fell into absolute silence. Even the normally bustling observation galleries where junior diplomats and aides typically whispered among themselves had gone quiet. The gravity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Speaker Thymol's energy field flickered as he processed the information. "How long do we have before these entities reach inhabited space?" "According to our calculations," Zethra replied, "the first wave of whatever is coming will reach the Outer Rim colonies in approximately 47 standard cycles. But that's not the worst part." She manipulated the display one final time, showing a complex web of energy readings emanating from Earth's solar system. The patterns looked almost organic, like the nervous system of some impossibly vast creature. The reality anchors aren't just dismantling the ancient barriers randomly. The patterns suggest they're following some kind of sequence, some predetermined order. It's as if the humans have accidentally activated an ancient protocol, one designed to systematically unlock every containment seal the ancients ever created. The implications were staggering. If the ancients had sealed away multiple threats across the galaxy, and if the humans had unknowingly triggered a process to release them all, then the entire known universe was in danger. Ambassador Krell's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. "We must contact the humans immediately. Surely once they understand the danger, they will shut down these reality anchors." Zethra's laugh was bitter and humorless. "We tried that 3 cycles ago. Do you know what the human representative told us?" she said, and I quote, "We appreciate your concern, but we have everything under control. These reality anchors are providing us with unprecedented insights into the fundamental nature of existence. The potential benefits to all sentient life far outweigh any theoretical risks." The chamber erupted again, but this time the anger was directed at humanity rather than the situation itself. Several representatives demanded immediate military intervention to force the humans to shut down their devices. "It gets worse," Zethra continued over the noise. "When we shared our sensor readings showing the approaching entities, the humans thanked us for the fascinating data and said they were eager to study these new phenomena when they arrived." She shook her head in disbelief. "They think this is a scientific opportunity. They have no concept that they've doomed us all." As if summoned by the discussion, the chamber's communication system activated. A holographic projection appeared at the center of the room. A human woman with short brown hair and wearing what appeared to be a white laboratory coat. She looked young by human standards, perhaps in her 30s, and her eyes sparkled with excitement and curiosity. "Greetings, Galactic Council," the human said with a cheerful wave. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of the Reality Research Initiative. I understand there's been some concern about our recent experiments, and I wanted to personally address any questions you might have." The assembled delegates stared at her in stunned silence. Here was the representative of a species that had potentially doomed the entire galaxy, and she looked as pleased as if she were announcing a successful science fair project. Speaker Thymel was the first to recover. "Dr. Chen, we have reason to believe your reality anchors are causing irreversible damage to the barriers established by the ancients. You must shut them down immediately." Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but she pulled out a small device and began reading from it. "I understand your concerns, but our latest readings suggest that what you're calling barriers are actually artificial constraints on space-time that have been preventing natural cosmic evolution for millions of years. By carefully removing these constraints, we're allowing the universe to return to its natural state." The silence that followed was deafening. Every representative in the chamber understood the implications of what she'd just said. The humans didn't just dismiss the ancient warnings, they actively believed that dismantling ancient safeguards was beneficial. "Dr. Chen," Zethra said slowly, "are you aware that entities from beyond our reality are approaching inhabited space as a direct result of your experiments?" "Oh yes," Dr. Chen replied enthusiastically. "We're incredibly excited about that. Our preliminary analysis suggests these entities represent entirely new forms of consciousness that have been isolated from our reality for eons. First contact with truly alien intelligence. This could be the greatest discovery in human history." She paused, apparently consulting her device again. "In fact, we're preparing a reception committee to greet them when they arrive. We've been working on translation protocols and communication methods. This could be the beginning of a new era of interspecies cooperation and understanding." The assembled delegates exchanged looks of horror and disbelief. The humans weren't just ignoring the danger, they were actively welcoming it. Speaker Thymel tried one more time. "Dr. Chen, the ancients sealed these entities away for a reason. They represent a threat to all existence." Dr. Chen's smile never wavered. "With respect, Speaker Thymel, the ancients are gone. We don't know their motivations or their reasoning. It's possible they were wrong, or that their solutions were simply the best they could manage with the technology available to them. Humanity has always believed that no barrier should remain unquestioned, no frontier should remain unexplored." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with conviction. "The universe is vast and full of wonders. If we let fear of the unknown guide us, we'll never discover the incredible truths that await us. Yes, there are risks. There are always risks when pushing the boundaries of knowledge, but the potential rewards are worth any price." The transmission ended, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. The human had just confirmed their worst fears. Not only were they dismantling ancient safeguards, they were doing it deliberately and with full awareness of the consequences. As the delegates sat in shocked contemplation, the chamber's sensors detected another wave of reality distortion spreading outward from Earth's solar system. Whatever the humans had awakened was getting stronger, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. In the depths of space, beyond the reach of any telescope or sensor, ancient things that had slumbered for eons began to stir. The seals that had held them were weakening with each pulse of the reality anchors, and soon they would be free to reclaim a universe they had once ruled. The ancients had warned against rousing humanity for good reason. Humanity's greatest strength, their inability to accept limits or heed warnings, had now become the galaxy's greatest threat. And as reality itself began to unravel around them, every civilization in the galaxy would soon learn why the ancients had feared the awakening of humanity more than any external threat. The age of containment was ending. The age of consequences was about to begin. 18 standard cycles had passed since the Galactic Council's emergency session, and the situation had deteriorated beyond anyone's worst predictions. Admiral Kethvar of the Combined Fleets stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Vigilance, watching sensor displays that showed readings he still couldn't quite believe. The first wave of entities had arrived. They weren't ships in any conventional sense. They weren't even physical in the way most species understood the term. The things emerging from the spaces between realities were living distortions in space-time itself, patches of existence where the normal rules of physics simply stopped applying. Some appeared as geometric impossibilities that hurt to look at directly. Others manifested as regions where time flowed in loops, causing the same moments to repeat endlessly. A few took forms that sensors couldn't even detect, only revealing their presence by the way everything around them began to change and warp. "Admiral," his communications officer, Lieutenant Vexta, called out with barely controlled panic in her voice. "We're receiving reports from Colony Nexus 7. The entities have... They've reached the Outer Rim settlements." Kethvar's jaw tightened as he reviewed the incoming data. The colony had been home to over 2 million beings from a dozen different species. The reports coming back were fragmentary and contradictory. Some claimed the colony was frozen in time. Others said it had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A few desperate transmissions suggested that the colonists were still alive, but had been changed in ways that defied description. "What about the evacuation fleets?" he asked. "Sir," Vexta paused, clearly struggling with what she had to report. "The third evacuation fleet approached Colony Nexus 6 hours ago. According to their last transmission, they successfully extracted approximately 50,000 colonists. But when they emerged from hyperspace at the designated rendezvous point, the refugees, they weren't the same species anymore." The bridge fell silent, except for the constant hum of the ship's systems. The crew had heard rumors about the transformations, but this was the first confirmed case involving their own people. "Show me," Kethvar ordered. The main display activated, showing a recording from the evacuation fleet. The image was distorted and flickering, but it clearly showed the rescued colonists in the ship's cargo holds. They were still recognizably sentient beings, but they had been fundamentally altered. Some possessed extra limbs that moved in impossible directions. Others had developed sensory organs that glowed with inner light. A few appeared to exist in multiple spatial dimensions simultaneously, their forms shifting and overlapping in ways that made the recording equipment struggle to process the images. But the most disturbing part wasn't the physical changes, it was the expressions on their faces. Every single refugee showed the same look of profound understanding and terrible knowledge, as if they had learned secrets about reality that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. Are they still themselves?" Kethvar asked quietly. "We don't know, sir. They've been trying to communicate, but..." Vexta activated the audio feed. The sounds that emerged from the speakers weren't quite language as any known species understood it. The words seemed to have additional dimensions, carrying meanings that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something deeper in the listener's mind. "We see now," the transformed beings said in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that created new sounds. The barriers were not protection. They were blindness. The ancients feared not what was outside, but what they would become if they allowed themselves to evolve beyond the limitations of single-dimensional existence. Kethvar cut the feed immediately, but the words continued to echo in his mind. This was the pattern they'd been seeing across every contact zone. The entities weren't destroying civilizations. They were changing them, transforming them into something new and alien. "Sir," his tactical officer interrupted, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. It's Dr. Chen again." Kethvar suppressed a surge of anger. The human scientist had been broadcasting regular updates throughout the crisis, treating the unfolding catastrophe as if it were the most exciting scientific expedition in galactic history. Her enthusiasm in the face of universal terror had become almost legendary among the combined fleets. "Put her through," he ordered. Dr. Chen's image appeared on the screen, but something was different about her. She looked the same as before, but there was something in her eyes, a depth that hadn't been there in previous transmissions. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal space-time. "Admiral Kethvar," she began with her characteristic smile, "I wanted to update you on our progress with the first contact protocols. The initial encounters have been absolutely fascinating. These entities aren't hostile at all, they're teachers." "Teachers?" Kethvar couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. "Dr. Chen, they're transforming entire populations into something unrecognizable. How can you call that teaching?" Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but when she answered, her words carried those same additional dimensions that the transformed refugees had possessed. "They're showing us what we really are, Admiral. What all consciousness really is when it's not limited by the artificial constraints we've built around ourselves. The ancients didn't seal these entities away because they were dangerous. They sealed them away because they offered a form of evolution that the ancients weren't ready to accept." She paused, and for a moment, Kethvar could have sworn he saw her form flicker slightly, as if she were existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "The reality anchors weren't designed just to pierce the barriers," she continued. "They were designed to ensure that when evolution came, it would come gradually, allowing each species to choose their own path forward. We're not forcing change on anyone. We're simply removing the artificial limits that prevented natural growth." The implications of her words hit the bridge crew like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just accidentally triggered the release of ancient entities. They had deliberately designed their technology to transform the entire galaxy. "Dr. Chen," Kethvar said slowly, "are you still human?" Her smile widened, revealing something that might have been additional rows of teeth, or possibly geometric patterns that existed in spaces between normal matter. "I'm more human than I've ever been, Admiral. I'm what humanity becomes when we stop accepting arbitrary limitations." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Every crew member was processing the same horrifying realization. The humans hadn't made a mistake. This had been their plan from the beginning. "Sir," the sensor operator called out urgently, "I'm detecting massive energy signatures approaching our position. Multiple contacts, unknown configuration." The main display shifted to show long-range sensors. Against the star field, shapes were approaching that defied easy description. They moved like living things, but were clearly composed of some form of exotic matter. Some resembled vast jellyfish with trailing tentacles that stretched across light years. Others looked like geometric crystals that constantly folded and unfolded through dimensions that hurt to perceive directly. "Distance and approach vector," Kethvar demanded. "Approximately 2 light hours and closing at..." Sir, they're not traveling through normal space. They're moving through folded dimensions. At their current rate, they'll reach us in approximately 6 hours. Kethvar activated his fleet-wide communications. All ships, this is Admiral Kethvar. We have incoming entities approaching our position. All vessels are to maintain defensive positions, but do not engage unless directly threatened. We still don't fully understand their capabilities or intentions. The next few hours passed in tense preparation. The combined fleets had assembled the largest military force in galactic history, over 3,000 ships representing 24 different species and containing the most advanced weaponry ever developed. But every tactical analysis suggested that conventional weapons would be useless against entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. As the entities drew closer, their effects on local space became apparent. Gravity began to fluctuate in strange patterns. Time itself seemed to flow differently in various parts of the fleet formation. Some ships reported that their instruments were detecting impossible readings, negative mass, backwards causality, spatial dimensions that folded back on themselves. "Admiral," Vexta reported, "we're receiving a communication. It's not coming through our standard channels. The signal seems to be arriving directly in our computer systems." "Let me hear it." What came through the speakers wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite telepathy. It was something that bypassed normal sensory processing and spoke directly to consciousness itself. "Greetings, children of limited dimensions," the entities communicated. "We come not as conquerors, but as gardeners returning to tend a garden that has been left wild for too long. The beings you call ancients were our predecessors, an earlier iteration of consciousness that chose stagnation over growth. They sealed us away not because we threatened existence, but because we threatened their control over the evolution of consciousness itself." The communication paused, and during that pause, every crew member in the fleet experienced a brief flash of expanded awareness, a momentary glimpse of reality as the entities perceived it. The universe revealed itself as an infinitely complex web of interconnected consciousness, where every thought and every dream shaped the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The species you call humanity has proven themselves worthy of ascension by refusing to accept limitations. They alone among your civilizations had the courage to question the warnings left by their predecessors and the wisdom to actively seek transcendence rather than security. Through their actions, they have earned the right to guide their galaxy into its next phase of evolution. Admiral Kethvar found his voice, though speaking felt strangely difficult. "And what about the rest of us? What happens to those who don't want your transcendence?" "You have already chosen," came the reply. Every civilization that accepted the ancient warnings, every species that built their society around avoiding risk rather than embracing growth, every culture that chose safety over discovery, you have chosen stagnation. You will be preserved exactly as you are, unchanging and eternal, as monuments to what consciousness looks like when it fears its own potential. The meaning was clear. The entities weren't planning to destroy the unwilling. They were planning to trap them in permanent stasis, forever frozen at their current level of development, while the rest of the universe evolved beyond them. However, the communication continued, those who choose growth over security, who embrace change over certainty, who seek truth over comfort, they will be given the opportunity to transcend the limitations of single-dimensional existence and become something greater than they ever imagined possible. As the entities drew closer, their influence on local space-time intensified. Several ships in the fleet began to report that their crews were experiencing spontaneous expansions of consciousness. Crew members suddenly understanding concepts that had no names in any known language, perceiving colors and geometries that didn't exist in normal space, communicating thoughts that required new forms of mathematics to express. Some crews panicked and tried to suppress these changes. Others embraced them, and their ships began to transform, taking on configurations that were beautiful and terrifying in their impossibility. "Admiral," his science officer reported with wonder in her voice, "I'm detecting something incredible. The space around us. It's not just changing randomly. There's a pattern to it, a structure. It's like reality itself is being rewritten to support new forms of existence." Kethavar looked at his displays and realized that everything had changed. The crisis wasn't about invasion or destruction. It was about evolution on a scale that no previous civilization had imagined. The humans had triggered something that would transform the very nature of consciousness throughout the galaxy. And as he watched his instruments detect the approach of even more entities from beyond normal space-time, he realized that the real question wasn't whether they could stop this transformation. It was whether they would choose to be part of it or be left behind as relics of what consciousness used to be before humanity taught it to dream of something greater. The age of transcendence had begun, and every species in the galaxy would soon be forced to choose between evolution and eternal stagnation. One standard year had passed since what historians would later call the Great Awakening, and the galaxy had become something unrecognizable to those who remembered the time before. Ambassador Zethra stood in what had once been the Galactic Council chambers. Though the crystalline halls now existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, their architecture shifting based on the consciousness of those who observed them. She had chosen transformation. The decision hadn't been easy. For months after the entity's arrival, she had watched as civilization after civilization faced the same choice: evolve beyond their current limitations or remain forever frozen in their existing state. Some species had chosen preservation, accepting eternal stagnation in exchange for the security of remaining exactly as they were. Their worlds had been encased in temporal barriers that would protect them from change until the heat death of the universe itself. But Zethra had seen what lay beyond those limitations, had felt the touch of expanded consciousness during her first contact with the entities, and she could not bear the thought of remaining trapped within the narrow confines of single-dimensional existence for eternity. The transformation process had been unlike anything in recorded history. The entities, who called themselves the architects of possibility, didn't impose change from the outside. Instead, they removed the artificial constraints that had been limiting consciousness, allowing each being to evolve according to their own nature and desires. For Zethra, the change had been gradual but profound. Her four arms had multiplied into structures that existed in spaces between normal dimensions, allowing her to manipulate reality in ways that her former species couldn't even perceive. Her crimson eyes now saw across spectrums that had no names, perceiving the underlying mathematical structures that gave shape to existence itself. Her thoughts moved through networks of consciousness that connected her to every other transformed being in the galaxy. Yet she was still fundamentally herself, still Zethra, still possessing her memories and personality and individual identity. The transformation had made her more than she was, not someone else entirely. "The humans understood something that the rest of us missed," she said to her companion, a being who had once been Speaker Thymol, but was now something like a living constellation of connected energy patterns. They realized that consciousness isn't meant to remain static. It's meant to grow, to explore, to push beyond every boundary it encounters. Thymol's response came not as words, but as a direct transfer of complex emotional and intellectual concepts that would have required hours to express in any conventional language. In essence, he agreed, but added layers of understanding about how the transformation process had revealed the true nature of the ancient warnings. The ancients weren't evil, Thymol communicated. They were afraid. They had reached a point in their evolution where they could see the potential for consciousness to transcend physical reality entirely, to become something that existed independently of space and time. and that terrified them, because it meant giving up everything they thought they were. Through their expanded awareness, both beings could perceive the ruins of ancient civilizations scattered throughout the galaxy. Not physical ruins, but conceptual ones. Fragments of the barriers and constraints the ancients had built to prevent further evolution. Each barrier had been a choice, a decision to stop growing in favor of maintaining control. They chose fear over wonder, Zethra observed. They built their entire civilization around the premise that there were some things that shouldn't be known, some frontiers that shouldn't be crossed. And in doing so, they doomed themselves to evolutionary stagnation. The irony was profound. The ancients had been far more technologically advanced than any current civilization, capable of manipulating space-time itself and creating barriers that lasted for millions of years. But their very power had trapped them in a cage of their own making, preventing them from taking the final step toward true transcendence. The humans never had that problem, Thymol continued. Their entire species was built around the concept of pushing boundaries, of asking what if and why not, instead of accepting limitations. When they found the ancient warnings, they didn't see danger, they saw a puzzle to be solved. Through their connection to the collective consciousness of transformed beings, both ambassadors could perceive the current state of human civilization. Dr. Sarah Chen was still leading the Reality Research Initiative, though her work had evolved far beyond anything imaginable in the pre-transformation era. She now existed as a distributed consciousness that spanned multiple realities simultaneously, coordinating research projects that involved concepts for which no language had yet been developed. The humans had become something like shepherds for the transformation process, helping other species navigate the challenges of expanded consciousness while respecting each civilization's right to choose their own evolutionary path. They had established what they called transition zones, regions of space where beings could experience temporary glimpses of transcended existence before deciding whether to commit to permanent transformation. But perhaps most remarkably, they had also become the guardians of the preserved worlds, the planets where species had chosen stagnation over growth. The humans made sure those worlds remained perfectly isolated from the changes sweeping the galaxy, protecting the choice of civilizations that preferred eternal stability to uncertain evolution. It's fascinating how the roles have reversed, Zethra mused. The ancients tried to force stagnation on everyone. Now humanity ensures that those who choose stagnation can have it, while also making sure that those who choose growth aren't held back. Through their expanded perception, they could observe the ongoing transformation of galactic civilization. Roughly 40% of known species had chosen evolution, embracing changes that allowed them to exist across multiple dimensions, manipulate matter and energy through conscious intent, and perceive reality in ways that transcended the limitations of biological senses. Another 30% had chosen preservation, accepting eternal stagnation in exchange for the security of remaining exactly as they were. Their worlds had become museums of what consciousness looked like when it refused to grow, protected and maintained by the architects, but forever separated from the evolving galaxy around them. The remaining 30% were still deciding. Many species had requested extended time to consider their options, and the architects had been remarkably patient, allowing some civilizations decades or even centuries to make their choice. The transformation process couldn't be forced. Consciousness had to choose growth willingly, or the result would be not evolution, but destruction. The most interesting cases are the hybrid civilizations, Thymol observed, sharing data about species that had split along ideological lines. Some individual members had chosen transformation, while others selected preservation, creating societies where transcended and static beings coexisted in parallel realities that overlapped but never interfered with each other. Suddenly, Their expanded awareness detected a new presence approaching their position. It was Dr. Chen, though calling her by her former name was increasingly inadequate. She had become something like a living embodiment of humanity's drive to explore and understand, existing simultaneously across multiple planes of reality while maintaining connections to every human consciousness throughout the galaxy. Ambassadors? She communicated in harmonics that conveyed meaning across 17 different conceptual frameworks simultaneously. I wanted to share some exciting developments from our research into ancient history. The information she transmitted was staggering. The humans had discovered that the current transformation wasn't the first time this had happened. The architects of possibility were themselves the evolved descendants of a species that had faced similar choices millions of years ago. They had chosen growth over security, transcending their physical existence to become entities of pure consciousness that existed independently of space-time. The ancients, it turned out, had been their contemporaries, a species that had reached the same evolutionary threshold but had chosen differently. Instead of embracing transcendence, they had built barriers and constraints to prevent further evolution, believing that consciousness should remain tied to physical reality and limited by conventional dimensions. The conflict between the ancients and the architects wasn't a war in any conventional sense, Dr. Chen explained. It was a philosophical disagreement that lasted for millions of years. The ancients believed in control and limitation. The architects believed in growth and possibility. Neither side could force their choice on the other. So they agreed to separate. The ancients would build barriers to prevent evolution in this galaxy, and the architects would wait in parallel dimensions until consciousness chose growth on its own. The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened. Humanity hadn't accidentally triggered an invasion or awakened sleeping monsters. They had voted, on behalf of galactic consciousness, to choose growth over stagnation. Their reality anchors hadn't broken ancient barriers by accident. They had been designed by human scientists who unconsciously understood that consciousness was meant to evolve beyond its current limitations. The warnings weren't really warnings, Zethra realized. They were tests. The ancients left them to see if future consciousness would be brave enough to ignore them, creative enough to see beyond them, and wise enough to choose growth despite the risks. Exactly, Dr. Chen confirmed, and humanity passed the test, not just for themselves but for every species in the galaxy. By refusing to accept limitations, by pushing beyond every boundary they encountered, by treating warnings as challenges instead of obstacles, humans proved that consciousness in this galaxy was ready for its next evolutionary phase. Through their connection to the transformed collective, all three beings could perceive the ongoing expansion of consciousness throughout the galaxy. New forms of existence were emerging daily as transcended beings explored possibilities that hadn't existed before the barriers fell. Art was being created in dimensions that had no physical equivalent. Music was being composed using mathematics that described the emotional resonance of space-time itself. Love was being expressed through direct consciousness merger that allowed beings to share their entire existence with each other. But perhaps most importantly, the search for knowledge was continuing. The transformed beings hadn't reached some final destination. They had simply gained access to tools that would allow them to explore even greater mysteries. Questions about the nature of existence itself, the possibility of consciousness beyond even their current expanded form, the potential for transcendence that extended beyond individual realities. The ancients made their choice out of fear, Dr. Chen observed. They saw the infinite possibilities ahead and decided they were too dangerous to pursue. But infinity isn't scary. It's beautiful. It means there will always be new frontiers to explore, new questions to ask, new ways to grow and change and become something even more wonderful than what we are now. As if summoned by the discussion, the space around them filled with the presence of the architects themselves. These beings had transcended physical existence so completely that they could only be perceived as patterns of pure possibility, geometries of consciousness that existed independently of any material substrate. The test has been passed, the architects communicated in harmonics that resonated across every dimension of existence simultaneously. This galaxy has chosen growth over stagnation, possibility over control, wonder over fear. The barriers that limited consciousness for so long have been removed, and evolution can continue on its natural path. They paused, and in that pause, every transformed being in the galaxy experienced a moment of perfect understanding, a glimpse of what consciousness could become given infinite time and unlimited possibilities for growth. But this is not an ending, the architects continued. It is a beginning, the first step on a journey that has no final destination, only an eternal progression toward greater understanding, deeper connection, and more beautiful forms of existence. The species you call humanity has led the way, but now all consciousness in this galaxy will walk the path together. As the architects withdrew their direct presence, leaving behind only the gentle influence that helped consciousness explore its expanded capabilities, Zethra felt a profound sense of gratitude toward the beings who had once been her adversaries. The humans were right, she communicated to her companions. Reality is vast and full of wonders, and the only way to discover those wonders is to keep pushing forward, keep asking questions, keep refusing to accept that any boundary is permanent. Looking out across a galaxy that was transforming itself into something unimaginably beautiful and complex, she understood that humanity had given them the greatest gift possible. Not just the freedom to evolve, but the wisdom to embrace that evolution without fear. The ancients had warned against rousing humanity because they understood what humans would become once their potential was fully unleashed. They would become the species that refused to accept limitations, that pushed beyond every boundary, that asked questions no one else dared to ask. They would become the gardeners of consciousness itself, nurturing the growth of awareness throughout the galaxy, while ensuring that even those who chose stagnation could do so safely. And in becoming all of that, humanity had proven that consciousness was indeed meant to grow, to explore, to transcend every barrier it encountered. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. Reality itself had been transformed, not through force or conquest, but through the simple human refusal to accept that any limitation was permanent. And as consciousness continued to evolve toward possibilities that couldn't even be imagined yet, the universe itself seemed to smile with anticipation for whatever wonders lay ahead.